Hey everyone, I wonder how many of you have ever thought about the fact that one of the most basic questions of existence is why is there something instead of nothing? This is a question that can apply to anyone, and it's just a basic philosophical question, but it has grand implications, metaphysical implications. In fact, this is a question I like to use to get people to think about their own position on their worldview or the lens through which they interpret reality. Now, this is the second segment of a series I'm calling A Defense of the Christian Faith. And as a recap, I hope you get a chance to look at the previous segment if you haven't, because we're looking at ways that we can consider inferences to Christianity as being objectively true, or being able to articulate why we believe what we believe, going beyond merely testimony. So what can be termed natural theology? With that, we use induction to investigate God the same way we use it to investigate other things that we can't see, by observing their effects. So in this case, simplified, we see the effects and we make rational inference to the existence of a cause. And then we make some deductive arguments that are sound and that can draw some conclusions. Now, as a disclaimer, at this juncture, you probably realize you're going to need your thinking cap for much of today's topic. Like I said in the last segment, keep in mind that this whole format is called Valley Baptist University. And some of what we're looking at today could overlap with what could be taught in an apologetics class at a Christian university or even a seminary. In fact, some of the authors referenced in this are professors who teach at those levels. In this series I'm presenting, it represents an approach which is sometimes termed as classical Christian apologetics. It's an approach that builds on itself systematically. I will first attempt to present some classical arguments for the existence of God as they pertain to what Christian authors describe as general revelation, or sometimes called natural theology. You can see a support for this in Romans 1, 19 and 20 in your New Testament, where it states that God's existence can be understood by the things which are made. Know that similar to the other broad topics of apologetics in defense of Christianity, that few Christian theists would rest on any one of these arguments for the existence of God as being sufficient in and of itself. Instead, they build on each other. In fact, these are typically presented as pieces of evidence for the existence of God in accordance with what can be reasonably called objectively known truths apart from special revelation or personal experience. Also, I want to say this. Know that the themes of this and some upcoming segments do not pertain exclusively to Christianity. In fact, what we're looking at today could just be called monotheism. However, some of the subjects addressed here regarding the existence of a God resulted in the likes of many to have seeds of thought planted in their minds, resulted in ultimately them embracing the Christian belief of Jesus Christ. For others, the result has been a simple mental conversion to a rudimentary theism that some might call deism. You could call it a belief that there is a God or just a metaphysical cause, which is distinct from atheism or agnosticism. A great example of this is Antony Flew. He was an Oxford scholar who debated against theism until he changed his mind, and in 2007 he wrote a book called There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. Now let's go back. One of my favorite ways of approaching this subject is asking the general question, this basic philosophical question: why is there something instead of nothing? A legitimate answer to this lends itself to the discussion of what is called cosmological argumentations for the existence of God. So that's what we're looking at today to answer this. Cosmological argumentations for the existence of God. There exists the principle of causation. The principle of causation says every finite thing is caused by something else. A synonym for finite is contingent, or think of it as being dependent. Another way of putting it is everything that is contingent depends on something else for its existence. We looked at this a little bit last time. A book depends on an author for its existence. Interestingly, people will apply this principle in science, in history, in philosophy, and even like with the book, we apply it in daily life. And then people seem to want to turn it off and just disregard this principle when it comes to the ultimate origin of the cosmos. People will say a book depends on an author, but the cosmos doesn't depend on a cosmic author. Famously, pop scientist Carl Sagan inferred this. He said the cosmos is all that was, all that is, and all that ever will be. He doesn't apply that to his daily science, but he applies that to the cosmos. And we ask the question, how did he come to that conclusion? He certainly didn't come to it based on empirical reason or empirical research. And we would say he didn't come to that conclusion by inferring to the best explanation. You could almost be so bold as to say that this is like a blind faith statement. It's almost like a dogma, something that is not directly derived, especially from empirical investigation. So, contingent or dependent things need an explanation, and the explanation itself, importantly, can't be contingent or it creates a circularity. How did we get a book? Well, the book just depends on itself. It's circular reasoning. So this infers that there is something non-contingent, a necessary being. This something should be eternal, powerful, boundless, and unlimited. Robert Coons, a professor of philosophy at the University of Texas in Austin, he says all this is simply an inference to a metaphysical cause. He says, from all that we know that is physical, this is the best explanation as an answer to this question why there is something instead of nothing. There is a metaphysical cause, a non-contingent prime mover, an eternal creative mind. Now, I want to structure much of today's subject and its points on common pushbacks made against this by atheists or naturalists. If you were to ask somebody, why is there something instead of nothing? And they were to say, well, I don't know, or I think we'll come up with an answer. Well, you don't have an answer either. And you might say, well, it infers the best explanation is a metaphysical cause. And stopping right there, one of the first pushbacks is, oh, no, that's God of the gaps. That is the fallacious God of the gaps argument. Okay, right off, in its basic form, this argument is not a reference to God. Let's keep that in mind. It's certainly not a reference to the Judeo-Christian God of the Bible. Not only that, it's not a negative, but it's a positive inference. The God of the gaps charge is a charge to intellectual laziness because we can't explain something, so we introduce God or gods to cover our ignorance or laziness. The charge is you just haven't put in enough work, you haven't been patient enough, so let's just say God did it. I want to challenge you that inference to a metaphysical cause is not an I give up, I throw in the towel, let's just say God did it argument. Instead, you will find its proponents consider it to be an inference to the best explanation after research. Instead of science has answered everything but this, and we're just going to cling to this and tie a knot and hang on. No, no, no. John Lennox, example, at Oxford, a professor of mathematics and philosophy of science. He says, we are contending there is increasing scientific evidence that a creative mind and intelligence is responsible for the existence and operation of the universe. Likewise, again, Robert Coons at the University of Texas, Austin. He says, we have excellent empirical evidence for the generalization that wholly contingent facts have causes. At the very least, our experience warrants adopting the causal principle as a default or defeasible rule. He says this means that we may infer about any particular wholly contingent fact that it has a cause. Richard Swinburne, a colleague of Lennox at Oxford, he directly addresses this subject of God of the gaps. He's heard it so many times. He says, note, I am not postulating a God of the gaps, a God merely to explain the things that science has not yet explained. He says, I do not deny that science explains. But listen to the way he puts it. He says, I postulate God to explain why science explains. He says, the very success of science in showing us how deeply ordered the natural world is provides strong grounds for belief that there is an even deeper cause for that order. Think of it in this context. Somebody says, well, I just don't believe in God. You say, well, why is there something instead of nothing? And they say, well, that's just God of the gaps because we have science. No, let me rephrase that. Why is there science instead of no science? Contingent facts, contingent being, contingent matter infers a metaphysical cause. Swinburne states it this way, it's extraordinary that there should exist anything at all. Surely the most natural state of affairs is simply nothing, but there is something. So, the theistic believer says there is a metaphysical cause, a non-contingent, necessary prime mover, an eternal creative mind. And this is inference to the best explanation. All right, so this is atheist pushback number 2. And this is really common. The atheist says, okay, if everything needs a cause, then how come God doesn't need a cause? Now, this is where you step back and say, I want you to hear what I'm saying very carefully. It's not that everything needs a cause. It's that every contingent thing, every finite thing needs a cause. Famous atheist Bertrand Russell, an atheist of historical repute, in his book, Why I Am Not a Christian. I have a copy of that book. I have read it. Russell simply misrepresents the cosmological argumentation in his 1957 book. He says he came to the conclusion from reading John Stuart Mill's autobiography. He says Mill was taught by his father, who made me can't be answered because it immediately suggests the further question, who made God? So Russell states in his book, that very simple sentence showed me, as I still think, the fallacy of the argument of the first cause. Russell says if everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause. Now, it is remarkable that an atheist of Russell's stature, who is still quoted today, would say in writing that he is either ignorant or that he's intentionally strawmanning the contingency argument or its related cosmological argument. Russell is not even presenting the argument. He gets the argument itself wrong. It's not that everything needs a cause. It's that every finite thing needs a cause, or every contingent thing needs a cause. And this was articulated centuries before Russell. Going back to the 16 and 1700s, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a thinker, and also the cosmological framework, which was articulated centuries before Russell, which goes like this. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Notice it doesn't say everything that exists. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Even if you're using the designation God, which at this point we're not, but if someone were to say, well, who created God? Try to understand that God, by definition, does not have a beginning. This is what's being postulated. A non-contingent, metaphysical, eternal something to explain the physical, temporal, contingent something, the cosmos. You could even put it this way. Well, how do you explain God? Are you asking me to explain why the uncaused cause doesn't have a cause? This is called a categorical fallacy. It's like asking, what is the color of up? Now, this typically leads to pushback number 3. Okay, so why can't the universe be the non-contingent thing or be the infinite? This was already proposed centuries ago. In the 1700s, in the very least, philosopher David Hume says, why may not the material universe be the non-contingent being? And the Christian thinker simply responds a couple ways. One is, I'm going to put these in letter A and letter B. So why can't we think of the universe as eternal, as non-contingent, as the necessary thing? Letter A, we have strong support for the universe's contingency. Put another way, we have strong support that the universe had a beginning. Norm Geisler, Christian thinker, says this: the cosmos or material universe is a limited spatio-temporal system. It is, for example, subject to the second law of thermodynamics, and it is running down. Even the non-believer and the renowned physicist Paul Davies says the universe can't have existed forever. He says, we know there must have been an absolute beginning at a finite time ago. John Lennox of Oxford says he put it this way to his Oxford colleagues. He read from the book of Genesis, much to their chagrin. And he says, Genesis claimed that there was a beginning thousands of years before the evidence from cosmology came and before it came to challenge Aristotle's eternal universe idea. He says, now, suppose that scientists had taken the biblical claim that there was a beginning as a hypothesis and looked for ways of testing it. Lennox says, maybe we would have gotten to where we are now much earlier. He says the fact is there is a remarkable convergence between Genesis 1:1 and the contemporary thinking about the origin of space-time. Even the renowned late scientist Stephen Hawking has stated in his book, A Brief History of Time, which I own and I have read, he says the universe has not existed forever. Rather, the universe and time itself had a beginning. Stephen Hawking and his colleague Roger Penrose, he says, Penrose and I showed that Einstein's general theory of relativity implied that the universe must have a beginning. Now, Hawking realizes the implications of this. He did back then, as did his colleagues who pushed back on it. He says many people do not like, notice his wording, many people do not like this idea that time has a beginning, probably because it smacks of divine intervention. What a lot of people don't realize is that Christians going all the way back understood the implication of this idea. Not only going back to C.S. Lewis, but you could go back to Calvin, talking about time having a beginning that implies God. Even Augustine, time had a beginning and that implies God. Even the Christian thinker Boethius, all the way back into Augustine's time, time had a beginning and this implies God. And so what do these people who don't like that do? They use kind of a backhanded compliment to come up with all of these ideas. Now, some, as I would call this confirmation bias. Why are you going against Occam's razor to complexify all of these ad hoc ideas? Simply put, it's because they don't like the implications of this. And Stephen Hawking himself did this. Listen to what Hawking says. He says, I don't believe that the universe came into being at a singularity. And so he says, if we could only picture the universe in terms of imaginary time, there would be no singularities. But then Hawking admits, well, but then we go back to real time, which we live, and we still appear to have singularities. Think about a daily conversation that we have with people. I have these conversations. Why is it that you don't believe in God? I don't believe in all that imaginary stuff. What do you believe in? I believe in science. You realize that the most famous scientist in the world has recently said, let's just imagine imaginary time. Or if you were to ask them the question, why is there something instead of nothing? Well, I just hold to science. What is science saying? Science is saying just picture imaginary time. Now, this is why Hawking's own colleague who studied these things and came to the conclusion the universe had a beginning, his colleague Roger Penrose, a mathematical physicist, said, I have gradually come around to the view that it is actually misguided to ask that the space-time singularities of classical relativity should disappear when standard techniques of quantum or field theory are applied to them. So, why can't the universe be infinite? Letter A, because we have strong reason to hold the universe is contingent. The universe had a beginning. Letter B, very importantly, people need to understand that ascribing supernatural qualities to nature doesn't help the cause of naturalism, doesn't help the cause of atheism. Norm Geisler puts it this way. He says there's so many people that seem to think that, okay, the parts of the universe are contingent, but then the universe itself is just non-contingent and eternal. Geisler says, if one was to claim that the whole of the material universe is not temporal and limited, as are the parts, this would only demonstrate what theism claims. For his conclusion is that there exists beyond the contingent world of the limited spatio-temporality a whole reality that is eternal, unlimited, and non-contingent. In other words, hear him out, he says it agrees with theism that there is a God beyond the limited changing world of experience. That's this whole argument. That's the argument of a metaphysical cause. Geisler says it's simply a substitute for God, which admits that there is a whole reality that is more than the experienced part of reality and that has the metaphysical attributes of a theistic God. John Lennox puts it this way in the context of arguments against miracles and even the miracle of beginnings. David Hume denies miracles because miracles go against the uniform laws of nature. But elsewhere, Hume denies the uniformity of nature. It's like saying nature's uniform, nature's uniform, nature's uniform. Well, why is there something instead of nothing? Imaginary time and nature is actually metaphysical. Wait a minute. There was a time when nature was mythologized. We supposedly claim that we have scientifically outgrown that. But now we are moving more back into efforts to re-mythologize nature. Again, you go back to Carl Sagan with his capital C cosmos. Nature has a will. Nature determines things. Other authors will ascribe godlike qualities to nature and to the material, and yet they still call it material. Nature is eternal. Nature has a conscience called cosmic psychism. Nature is personal. Nature is purposeful. Nature has a plan. One of the four horsemen atheists, Harris, writes that there is a spiritual realm of the cosmos. Really? How are you doing that in the name of science? Now, there is a reason people have defaulted to this. It's in fact a backhanded compliment to the argument for a transcendent cause. William Lane Craig summarizes it this way. He says, as the cause of space and time, this entity must transcend space and time and therefore exist temporally and non-spatially, at least sans or before the universe. He says this transcendent cause must therefore be changeless and immaterial, since timelessness entails changelessness and implies immateriality. He says such a cause must be beginningless and uncaused, at least in the sense of lacking any antecedent causal conditions. So people understand this, and they sometimes bluntly reveal their propensity towards this confirmation bias, towards what they like. Here's an example. Sir Arthur Eddington said, philosophically, the notion of the beginning of the present order of nature is repugnant. He said, I should like to find a genuine loophole. Sir John Maddox, editor of Nature magazine for years, he said this. He said, the idea of a beginning is thoroughly unacceptable because it implies an ultimate origin of our world, and it gives creationists ample justification for their beliefs. Yes, it does. Thank you. Alan Sandage, one of the fathers of modern astronomy, discoverer of quasars, winner of the Crawford Prize, astronomy's equivalent of the Nobel Prize. He says this. He says, God, to me, is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something rather than nothing. So the atheist says this, okay, all right, scrap all that. Forget all that. We're going to stick with a naturalist explanation. So number 4, the atheist says, we can get something from nothing. There is a naturalistic answer how we can get something from nothing. In fact, atheist Lawrence Krauss wrote a book called Something from Nothing, and he's lectured on this. But when you follow it very, very carefully, it's misleading. And what you will find when you go to his books and lectures, that it's not really talking about something from nothing. They are redefining nothing. There are those who will say, well, in a quantum mechanical vacuum, there are virtual particles that spring uncaused. Now, besides the fact that it's disputed whether virtual particles even exist, even still, the quantum vacuum isn't nothing. You'll find out it's a fluctuating sea of energy, and it's a vacuum where a physical entity is existing in space and time, a quantum fluctuation model that does not envision the origin of a universe out of nothing. Oxford professor John Lennox, I've heard him speak in person several times. I've even met him a couple times. He said to a group discussing this subject, he said, people can say that we get something out of nothing, in his British accent. He says, let me ask you the question. How are we defining nothing? His point was, at this juncture, it just becomes a semantic word game. What people mean by nothing is not what most of us mean by nothing. There's an old saying by the philosopher Aristotle that nothing is what rocks dream of. To his Oxford colleagues, Lennox even said behind closed doors, he said, you realize you're playing games with this. You've changed the definition of nothing, haven't you? And he said, behind closed doors, they admit, well, yeah, we are. It's very common for people to hold to this. Just because we don't have a scientific answer now doesn't mean that by means of science we won't eventually find an answer to why there's something instead of nothing. We're working on it. We had Dr. J.P. Moreland, who's lectured on this and debated on this for years. We had him here at our church, and I've met him several times. He presented a list of things that the scientific method will never be able to demonstrate, and one of those is the origin of the universe, or the ultimate origin of the cosmos. And the reason is like what Oxford philosopher Richard Swinburne states. He says there cannot be a scientific explanation of the first state of the universe since there is nothing before it. In other words, somebody would have to say we're working on a naturalistic answer for the origins of nature. And some have even just sort of said, let's just accept the contradiction. They've even admitted that they're attempting to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And it just becomes nonsense. Still, however, there are those who have gone so far as to say that the universe could have actually come into existence by nothing and from nothing. And explanations of this go from the sublime to the outlandish. Peter Kreeft, professor at Boston University, points this out. He says, we become so complex and clever when attempting to dispute the basic, simple, and even intuitive causation argument. Even the person, Thomas Nagel, who calls himself an agnostic in his book Mind and Cosmos, he says we're kidding ourselves if we think this is even science versus faith. He says as just an unbiased observer, he says it's almost like it's faith versus faith. It's a lot like what Geisler and Turek's book shows when it describes itself, its title, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. The question is, what is the best explanation to why there is something instead of nothing? And if you're going one of these other paths, how much faith do you really need to have to go that way? In 2003, there was a debate between William Lane Craig and Quentin Smith at Harvard University. And Craig continued repeatedly to point out to those in attendance that Smith wasn't addressing this contingency argument with any sense of cohesiveness. And some of the transcript of Craig's questioning reads as follows. Here's an excerpt of Craig's first rebuttal following Smith's presentation of a circular causation theory of its own bootstraps is how the cosmos exists. Craig says, I would suggest this sort of circular causation ultimately doesn't work. He says, imagine that space-time is donut-shaped so that time goes in a circle. In that case, you could have every slice being caused by a prior slice. So ultimately, the universe would be circularly caused. But he says this is the sort of scenario Quentin envisions. He says that still leaves the question unexplained. Where did the donut come from? Granted, all the slices of the donut explain each other. You've still got to answer why you've got a donut rather than nothing at all. Craig says that's my contingency argument, which I don't think Quentin has responded to directly. And then following Quentin speaking, here's an excerpt of Craig again in his second rebuttal. Quentin Smith talked about elementary particles. And then Craig asks again, why are there any particles at all rather than nothing? He states anything finite that exists has an explanation for why it exists, either on its own nature or in an external cause. There's simply no reason in his theory why we should have this cluster of elementary particles in existence rather than non-being. So we need to have a metaphysically necessary being which will explain why there is something rather than nothing. Here's an excerpt of Craig's third response following Smith's conclusion, in which he still didn't address the subject of Craig's two above rebuttals. Craig says, well, the contingency argument, I think, has really gone unrefuted tonight. Why there is something rather than nothing. He says there must be an explanation, not merely for the beginning of the universe, but for why there is anything at all rather than nothing. Now, it's at this juncture that typically an atheist will hit number 5. Well, that just doesn't prove anything. You haven't proved to me God exists. Okay. For one thing, I'm not necessarily even talking about God here. I'm talking about a metaphysical, non-contingent, external cause. William Lane Craig states in his book, Creation Out of Nothing, see, the question then is whether a spontaneous origination of the universe out of nothing is as or more plausible as the creation of the universe out of nothing by a transcendent cause. Again, this is why we have the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Now, number 6, an atheist will very commonly push back. Okay, these are just arguments in your little Christian circles that have never been convincing to anyone, and that's why it's not convincing to me. Is that true? Have these things never been convincing to anybody about a metaphysical, transcendent, deistic prime mover? In fact, in a 2007 debate with John Lennox, Richard Dawkins, one of the most well-known atheists in the world, he admits that a serious case could be made for a deistic God. Not only that, Antony Flew, as I mentioned at the beginning of this segment, a longtime atheist and debater against Christian theism. He debated for 50 years, a half century. He's convinced and became convinced before he died that there is a metaphysical cause. This cosmological argumentation was just one of the ways that prompted Flew to change his position from atheism to deism, that there is some kind of metaphysical cause or God. He conceded to the cosmological argument of John Leslie as referenced in his following statements from his book, which I own. He says, Leslie asserts that the existence of the event of an infinite series of past events couldn't be made self-explaining through each being explained by an earlier one. He says, if there is an infinite series of books about geometry that owe their pattern to copying from early books, we still do not have an adequate answer as to why the book is the way it is about geometry, or, notice what he says, why there is a book at all. In other words, why is there a book instead of nothing? He says the entire series needs an explanation. Flew even said in a discussion with Swinburne, he said, I noted that his version of the cosmological argument seems to be right in a fundamental way. The universe is something that begs an explanation. Flew explained that he now held the universe was brought into an existence by an infinite intelligence. Now, Christians have been saying this, and they've been saying this just sometimes even by the implications of natural theology or what's called general revelation. Jonathan Edwards, one of the Great Awakening preachers who was very much into the Bible, still even Jonathan Edwards said, that whatsoever begins to be, which before was not, must have a cause why it then begins to exist. He says this seems to be the first dictate of the common and natural sense which God has implanted in the minds of all mankind and the main foundation of all our reasonings about the existence of things past, present, or to come. In the Bible, the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, in the first century, 2,000 years ago, said this, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. I want to ask you right now, having heard this, what remains your excuse to not believe, at least believe that there is a God? Or if this juncture you don't want to say a God, how about an eternal metaphysical cause? I want to challenge you that if you continue with this series, that you'll be able to articulate and express or be able to come to terms with what the book of Romans says, that God has revealed himself by what is made. And we'll look next time at the subject of the design argument. God bless and have a great day.